Hey everybody, what's up? Let me let me get myself situated here. Welcome to another amazing episode of AMA with LCJ. I am your host, Latoya Collins Jones, and I am super excited to be joining you all here today. So today we're going to be talking about. Sorry, I'm just going to adjust my microphone here. Today we're going to be talking about D and I. Now, this topic is one for those of you all who know. I actually came from that field, doing this field full time. So I am super duper excited to talk about it. As far as some questions that we have, if you are watching live and you have questions, I just want to encourage you to hop in and share them. Ask me right away. It does not actually have to be D&I related. That's just the route that I am going to be going, if you will, on today's live stream. But nonetheless, it's your world. I'm here to answer the questions that you all have. So super duper excited, like I said, about that. And yeah, I don't even know where to start. So first of all, here's where you can start. If you are watching, make sure that you say hey, share it, invite some people to the live stream to join in the conversation with to join in the conversation. I promise you it will be worth it. All right. So hopping in, got a lot of great comments last week, particularly as we talked about, culture. We had a couple of people asking questions around career and where you were wanting to go with your career. And it was just a great time. And I absolutely enjoyed everybody who was chiming in. It was a blast. I just will say that. Um, so let's start. Why did I want to talk about DEI? There's a couple reasons why I wanted to talk about the DEI space, and that for those of you all don't know, it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. For some people, they have belonging in there. For some people, they've added justice in that topic as well. So it's a little bit of, I guess, everything, if you will, in terms of like DEI, really around the acronyms kind of get longer as time has gone by, but diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and then we are also seeing, some people are also using justice as a means as well. So I will say the reason why this has come up is because I feel like it's honestly it's come up a lot for me in my current world. Um, so in terms of some meetings I'm having, the conversations I'm having, although my company Culture by Design is further reaching, if you will, than D&I feel like it's important to note um, that I still think it's a very important topic to discuss in what we talk about. So I wanted to dive right in and have these conversations. One of the things that I think about, I've gotten asked already is when you think about diversity and inclusion and the recent Supreme Court decision, what does that actually mean? Well, let's start off right. Um, I don't think that diversity and inclusion is dead. With the recent Supreme Court decision, what I do see happening is there is um, a shift, if you will, around the conversation. And I think right now we're in a space and a place where everything is polar, like everything's polarized, right? So you go, okay, if I am pro DEI, then I'm anti DNI. If I am pro this, I'm anti that. And I think what's happening in all of these conversations, the people the who's losing this game ultimately are the people. It's the people in your organizations. In the political realm, it's your constituents. That's who's actually losing in this battle of DNI, anti DNI, etc. It can be an unpopular opinion, but it is what it is. I stand by what I said. Um, And so, how do we move back to more of a people centric focus and people centric conversation as it pertains to DEI and not just this idea? So, it's funny, I had a call before this, and him and I were talking, and I was like, the funny thing is, most people who are speaking out against DEI can't actually tell you what diversity and inclusion is, what a diversity and inclusion office actually does, because the number one thing around a lot of this is um, I can't hire solely based on race, sexual orientation, gender, nationality, like all of these ethnicity, all of these things. I can't actually, that's discrimination. It literally is against the law. And so I think what has happened is because it's been now politicized, people are either afraid their companies are going to walk backwards from it. Um, they're afraid that people are losing their jobs who are in the DEI office. So all of these pieces of the puzzle are really kind of starting to play out in terms of what does the future of DNI look like? What does the future of DNI in a corporate environment looks like? What does it look like in education? And we've seen kind of how all of this is played out. Um, Now, do I think it's dead? I do not. I do not think diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, I don't think it's dead, but I do think that what we're going to start to see is an evolution, right? I think that there's going to be an overarching evolution of the space and the place, right? So how do we evolve? What does that look like? And so there's some questions that I just want to get to. And so I'm going to actually put up the first question that we got, which is why is diversity and inclusion important in the workplace and how can organizations prioritize it? Why is diversity and inclusion important in the workplace and how can organizations prioritize it? So this is a really good question that we got. Um, Diversity and inclusion is important first and foremost. Let me just start at the tippity top level, okay? Diversity and inclusion at the highest level is important because it's the right thing to do. Period. Okay. I cannot stress that enough. It's the right thing to do. Um, in addition to that, in addition to it being the right thing to do, the second piece of that puzzle is it just makes business sense, right? If you go back, the research shows that organizations who are more diverse are more profitable, they're more innovative, like all the things, right? Sorry, y'all. I'm gonna lower this just a bit. I was like, I have so much headspace up here. Um, Organizations who are really good at DNI they're more profitable, right? Like if you think about how you go about solving a problem, if everybody came from the same place, same thing, same experience, then you're not actually approaching it at the widest angle that you could possibly get at. So, in terms of why diversity and inclusion is important in the workplace, number one, it's the right thing to do. And if that's not enough, number two is good. It's just good business sense. If you don't believe me, go in, do the research do the research. The research will show you it just makes business sense to be serious about diversity, inclusion, and equity and belonging in your workforce. When you also think about employee experience, and happier employees make happy customers make happy business owners, right? So all of those things, they really all do connect together. And so how can organizations prioritize it? Um, this is one that I think it's always I wouldn't say it's always tough. Um, it's always tough in terms of, hey Dan, I see your question. I'll make sure I get to it. It's always tough because how can organizations prioritize it? If you believe as an organization that your people is what powers your organization, like who like, hey, I'm all bought in, I'm all sold out on people first, then there's you already know how to prioritize it. I think you know, what organizations choose to focus on, what they not what they say, but what they do, how they lead, how they prioritize. Like there are lots of companies who say, "Hey, we prioritize D&I," and yet when you look behind the curtain, there are other competing priorities, and that's how you actually know it's not right. Um, I think D&I should be in the forefront because I think people should be at the forefront, not just D&I, people as a whole. And I think you're starting to see more organizations move towards this kind of more this people office, this culture office, this employee experience office, because I think that those are the things that are actually going to make businesses tick. And I think those are going to be the organizations that are going to last. Um, Here's the other thing, this is just me nerding out. In the very beginning, there was no such word as priorities, plural. It was priority. You had one priority. I forget, man, my research escapes me right now. But over the X amount of years, over the last few decades, several decades, things have went from priority to priorities. Now, let me give you a really good example of the fact that technically there's only one priority. Which is why I say, like, if people is your priority, then D&I is technically your priority. And then everything else will, if people learn to trust, that everything else will follow. If you're in an airplane, one of the very first things that they say is if something pops off, right? This is my translation. If there are any people in the airline industry, I know this is not your version of it. This is my version of how I actually hear it, right? So somebody says, "Yo, if something pops off, this oxygen mask is going to come down. Before you worry about anybody else, put it on yourself." Right? That's what they say. You're the priority. You may have family amongst you, right? But everybody's priority is themselves to get it and then they spread, which is why I think priorities becomes such a detrimental issue long term. I think that there are focuses, but I think that there should all only be one priority. And I think that that would help things get a lot clearer and crystallized. If an organization says, "Hey, our people are number one, we want to make sure this is the best place to work for real, not just the badge," and then because we know that's true, then we're going to focus on developing our team members and developing our people, like the whole nine. Then I think that's where all of the magic actually happens. So that was a good question. So great question from the audience. Dan, who or which companies are doing it right when it comes to D&I right now? Ooh, I'm here's what I'll say. This is a very interesting question, Dan. You put me in quite the pickle, if you will. Um, I will say, there are a few that come to mind. I think Microsoft is crushing it. That's because I know some of the work that they're doing research wise, really around the future of work, and they're figuring it out. I think they were recently in the news for sharing how their employee feedback loop goes, and they were trying to revolutionize what that looks like. So I think that they're doing really well. Procter and Gamble is another company where I feel like they've figured it out. And what I mean by that is if you look at, the very first thing that they dropped was like the look, right? When they were hiring to tell stories from a diverse perspective, they're hiring um, they're hiring a diverse news crew. So I think that those things matter. So when we think about companies that are doing it right, I think they are looking at it more holistically. They're not just looking at just their team members. They're looking at who's helping tell their story. They're looking at who they're hiring, who they're procuring, and what that looks like. And so I think Procter Gamble to me, I think is also doing exceptionally well. Google actually recently, I'd say over the last couple of years, they've implemented, they've implemented like a retention team. And so their role and responsibilities Actually, I just got a chance just to talk with this past weekend with someone who that's kind of what they do, and they come in and in their underrepresented groups they pair them up with somebody when they're coming in and they're onboarding, and so you kind of come into this massive organization and you're not going by themselves, and you're having somebody kind of show you the ropes. So I think that that's really cool, and it's not necessarily like a person of color gets paired with a person of color, right? But they are being intentional in helping people make connections and making connections with more senior leaders, like out of the gate. So I think that that's going to be it's going to prove to be really well done, and I think there's a level of intention that happens when you're doing that specifically with your underrepresented talent. So Dan, that's a very interesting question because I think everybody's a long ways off, especially in the tech industry. Long ways off, long ways off. Now, here's the deal. We're not going to make these leaps and bounds tomorrow, but how can we figure out within our system, James Clear, you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems, right? That we can make sure that even as we are pursuing a more diverse and inclusive workspace and workplace, what can we put in place in the meantime to ensure that each employee has a great employee experience? And that those are going to be the companies that I think are going to be the ones who do it well. So great question. Sorry, you all. I broke my number one rule, which is like not eating directly before I do speakings and things like that, but my day ran long. So great question. Love that question, Dan. So the next question, let me see the next question. Oh, this one is fun. This one's fun. So Dan, I appreciate the questions a ton. And all right, there we go. So what's the next set of questions that we have? This is a good one. So how can organizations foster cultural diversity and create an inclusive environment for employees from different backgrounds? Ooh. This one's fun. How do we do this? How can organizations foster cultural diversity and create an inclusive environment for employees from different backgrounds? I think there's a couple of things. Depending on how big or large your organization is, one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle, a lot of organizations lean on affinity groups or employee resource groups, or they call them business resource groups that fit certain groups. And I think that's kind of one of the ways that people do that. You know, I think one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle is how organizations foster cultural diversity and create an inclusive environment. I think it goes back to your overarching employee experience, your expectations, and the culture that you have, right? So if you go in and you create an organization that has a culture that is built on making sure that the people you work with know, kind of what it is that you like, your preferred method of communication, past work experience, like that how behavior, then I think a question like this becomes less, I don't want to say less important, but I think it becomes less of an issue, right? So if you think about how to foster cultural diversity and create an inclusive environment, one of my things which I talked about even last week, which is know your people. Know your people. If you sit down and you're a leader, you should know and understand what's going on. Now, you're not going to be able to go out and say, okay, I'm going to learn everything I need to know about this culture or this community or this country. You're not going to be able to know it all. And no one group is a monolithic people. So the best thing that you can do is get to know people, because I think when you do that, the bigger piece of that puzzle is this inclusive environment. And an inclusive environment fosters cultural diversity. Does that make sense? Like, if you create an organization where inclusion becomes the core of what it is, doesn't matter what your background is, it's the work you do, it's how you show up, all of these things. I think fostering cultural diversity automatically happens because you're fostering a good culture. I hope that made sense. It made sense up here. But those are things that I think about in terms of how do you go about doing that. And so, but here's what I'll say. The other piece of this puzzle, let me get very practical because I don't want to gloss over and say some really like esoterical types of things as well. I want to make sure that I'm also covering like the really reals. The other thing that organizations can actually do to foster it, foster cultural diversity, is education. But I'm not the biggest fan of only education. I believe practical makes things more real and more in sense. But here's what I'll say. Um, how do you foster that? You encourage your leaders to hire outside of their norm, out of their areas of comfort, right? So I'll use, since I'm in Austin, I'll use a good example. Area of comfort for probably most people here in Austin, if you're hiring, is UT, Texas A&M. I may squeeze a Baylor in there. Um, I don't see a ton of Texas Tech, but like that's kind of where you're starting to see where people are plucking the talent. In order to foster cultural diversity, that means I've got to go to Prairie View A&M. I've got to go to Texas State. I've got to go to Austin Community College. I've got to go to Texas Southern. I've got to go to University of Houston, U of H. I've got to go to even UT El Paso, right? Now we're talking about fostering cultural diversity. That's practically how you do it, right? Not just kind of going through these same ponds, like, oh, I can't find them. Like, are you looking? What does this look like? So I think there's kind of this two, I always struggle with the question about like culture diversity, inclusive environment, because I think it's sometimes chicken egg scenario depending on where you are in your D&I journey as an organization. So really good question. Really good question. Hey y'all, make sure if you're watching that if you have questions, let me know. I'll pop them up. I want to be able to make sure that we are having a dialogue. If you are watching on Facebook and you want to make a comment, I believe you have to go in and give StreamYard permission to say yes. I want to make a comment, just as a heads up. So let's keep it rolling. What other questions do we have? Da, da, da. We're gonna go ahead and hide this one. So you all are quiet today. Not a whole lot of questions here. Coming from the audience today. Y'all were on fire last week. Okay, so what else do we have in terms of questions? Okay, this one is good. What role does leadership play in creating a safe and inclusive space for diverse perspectives? Ooh. Oh, this one's good. One of the things that you see a lot of talk about, I'd say, especially in organizations that I would say are more multicultural, multinational companies. When we think about creating a safe and inclusive space for diverse perspectives, one of the things that we hear a lot about is like diversity of thought, right? How do you have this diversity of thought? And I think this one is huge, because there's another question. I'm not gonna go into that particular question because they're very similar. But the other question behind that was, how can leaders actively engage with underrepresented groups within their teams or organizations? And oddly, I think both of these go together. Leadership, when you, whether it's underrepresented groups, majority groups, engaging in general, a safe and inclusive space for any diverse perspective is imperative. If you are a leader, you cannot lead if you are not creating psychological safety. If you don't have psychological safety within your organization, here's what I'll tell you. It's specifically with your team. If you don't have psychological safety within your team, they ain't gonna tell you when the house is on fire. House gonna be on fire. You're not gonna know, right? No psychological safety, you're not going to necessarily know or understand um, what the temperament of the team is. You're not going to understand what hurdles they're facing. Part of being an effective leader, not a manager or a boss, I like to say leader. Part of being an effective leader is your job is to kind of show you work for them. And in order for you to work for them, they have to trust you. They have to know who you are. Notice I didn't say like, because sometimes not everybody who works for you is going to like you. In a perfect world, yes, you absolutely want people to like you, everyone to like you. I'm also believe in being a realist. So not everybody may like you, or they may not like all the decisions that you make. But what will reign true through all of that is psychological safety. And so if you can get a level of psychological safety within your team, that's how you create a safe and inclusive environment. So a lot of people don't necessarily they want to build the trust, but you don't have the psychological safety, right? Trust is a part of this, right? But like, oh, my team trusts me. They trust me, right? Um, but psychological safety says, hey, I don't agree, or when I need to speak up, or when I disagree, I feel safe enough to say so. And so, as a leader, in order for places, like in order to create this safe and inclusive space, that's a day to day thing, right? Like, what happens when somebody fails? What happens when somebody speaks up? What happens when somebody says that they don't agree? How you respond in all of those moments matters. Because if you go in and be like, oh, that's just Jim being Jim, then that person has lost psychological safety with you. You don't have psychological safety. So, leaders, the role that leadership plays in creating a safe and inclusive space for different perspectives is how psychologically safe is your organization? Are things brought up and then not handled and swept under the rug? I I have this different perspective, like, um, and so I think it becomes a lot harder and more difficult as a leader if you don't do this. I think it's imperative. And I think it's necessary that you have psychological safety. When you have that, when you create that as a leader, then the safe, inclusive space for different ideas, diverse perspectives is automatically the case. And I'll say this, I got another question. Oscar, I see your question. Um, Here's what I'll say about this, especially when we say diverse perspectives. Just because it's just two things can be true. Okay. Oftentimes, when we look at creating a safe and inclusive in space or environment, we go with the either or approach, and we don't always go into this both and scenario. Um, Two things can be true and still not actually agree. Did y'all catch that? Two things can be true, right? I can experience something from my perspective, which is true to how I felt. I'm gonna pick on Oscar because he just dropped the question. Oscar could have um, had that same experience, experienced something, and like he spoke up and he experienced it differently. Both of those things can be true. And so it's okay. There doesn't always have to be this polarizing, like, you're right, I'm wrong type of scenario. And so I think if we're willing to kind of go into this and space more often, I also think that that will help create and foster a safe and inclusive um, work environment. Oscar, so I love Oscar's question. Let me put it up. Okay, Oscar says, in the future, will we still have D&I positions like chief diversity officers, chief DEI officers, or chief inclusion officers in an organization, or will organizations have the CHRO or chief people officer oversee D&I? Ooh, um, this is a good question. Um, I I think I'll this is what I'll say. I don't think DEI is going to ever go away. I think the office may eventually morph. I think you're starting to see some companies. I'm just saying what I'm seeing, right? I'm not. This is not law. This is not Toya's law. This is what I'm seeing, if you will. But what I am seeing is you are starting to see, I would say, like people sitting in this like VP or director roles, and not necessarily having like a C-suite office behind it. Um, I will personally tell you, I'm probably not the biggest fan of like CHROs, chief people officers, depending on the size of the organization where HR is overseeing all of D&I. There there's a saying, if you're in the D&I space, there is a saying that says, hey, D&I is the place, HR is the place where D&I goes to die. And there are a lot of D&I practitioners who openly speak out against D&I, sitting in an HR or people office. I think some of this, Oscar, really is the mindset of an organization. Um, I think you see in larger organizations, it does sit in that people office or HR office. I think one of the biggest things I think, man, I've said I think a lot. I got to work on that. But one of the things that I see, if you will, when you go into an HR office or a people office, is you have to think the history of HR is this. HR was created initially, right, to help function with the humans, like human resources. We need help doing this. We need help onboarding. Then eventually it became, not only that, we need you to help make sure we're legal and mitigating risk for the company. And so where I think it becomes problematic is when you have traditional HR functions and or people functions that are in the business of protecting the company first and always. And I think that that becomes where it becomes tough, because typically HR are your risk mitigators, right? The business of D&I can be disruptive and can be risky. And so, do you have two groups that um, do you have two groups that have competing priorities, right? Like, and I think that that can become a little bit tough. I can't really say if this will go away, but I do think it's evolving. And I said this earlier in an earlier question. I do believe like that the office as a whole is going to evolve, because you have to look at the whole system. If you have a chief diversity officer, DEI officer, chief inclusion officer, all these people, and they're not empowered, then they're a figurehead anyways, right? Andrea, yeah. A lot of box checking. Right. Exactly. Then it's just figureheads. Like, and that's what I think is becoming a bigger piece of that puzzle. The question is whether you have the C suite or you have this office within CHRO or the people office. The question is, are they empowered to make the changes that they need? Or is this virtue signaling? And it's good for business to make sure that we say that we have the thing, but they're not actually doing the thing. Because in order to make real change in any organization, especially when it comes to diversity and inclusion and equity, is you have to look at the systems. And typically people don't want you looking under the hood. So if you look under the hood, and you're starting to find things, the tinkerers, a lot of times, I would say I'm definitely a disruptor. Once you start to disrupt and tinker, what is your tolerance as an organization? So I think, Oscar, it's hard to say right now. I think it'd be interesting. I'm not even trying to be funny, but I think it'll be interesting to see after another election cycle, because this has been so heavily politicized, really what this is and what this isn't. I hate that it's gotten to this in terms of where the space and place is, but I think you got to mention it. You got to mention it, which actually leads me to my next question. LinkedIn user, that's all it says. Do I believe organizations mostly foster D&I culture or policy because it is the vision, or is it just to cover the legal landscape? Ooh, we spicy today. Come on. Okay. I got you. Andrea, I see your question too. Do I believe organizations mostly foster D&I culture and policy because it is the vision, or is it just to cover up legal landscape? So I'll cover the legal landscape first because I think it's a little bit easier to answer. First and foremost, um, D&I cultures and policies are very different than like your actual what I would say is like your employment like types of things. So if you think about the EEOC, anti-discrimination policies, like all of that sits whether you have a D&I office or not, um, those things will exist. It is period point blank EEOC, equal opportunity employers, you have to reside by that, right? Um, and oh, hey Abigail. So that's kind of like the first piece of the puzzle. Okay. Now, when you go into foster D&I culture and policy because it is a vision, I do believe some organizations are more aspirational in their efforts than they're willing to admit. I do. I do. I think more organizations are aspirational than they care to admit. Um, when you think about kind of like really even like the history, like if you go all the way back, when you go back and you do look at EOC and affirmative action and Title 7, Title 9, like you start to look at all of these things over time. Um, and really the history of D&I think the progress has kind of been gradual, um, but not necessarily keeping at the pace in which I'm speaking for the US, at the pace at which America is diversifying. When I think about the culture as a whole, you've got internet revolutionized business, right? So you've got the entire world at your fingertips. And so I think that helps accelerate what diversity looks like. And so sometimes it becomes tough because it's easy to look at diversity when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, where we sit within our country. Um, or within our respective places. And so, how do you figure those things out? What does that look like? And I do think some stuff is more aspirational than people care to admit because depending on how long you've had your organization, if it's not built in and by design, it is absolutely aspiration and vision because you'll have to break it to fix it. And nobody wants to break stuff, right? So I think the league. So here's what I'll tell you. I'm going to actually add something else to this, Abigail. I'm going to add a little asterisk to this. I do think so. You asked me, does it foster D&I culture policy because it's a vision, or is it a cover to cover the legal landscape? I'm going to add one more piece of that puzzle. Some people also do it because it's branding. So I think it's less legal because legal is legal. What's legal or illegal is very clear for the most part in all black and white what you can or cannot do as it pertains to discrimination and harassment. But I think some companies know and understand that they're not going to get the best talent. They know and understand that their customer base is not going to tolerate you making efforts to diversify your things, whether that's your marketing, whether that's your workforce. I'll be honest, like even when I'm looking at things, when I'm looking at a conference, when I'm looking at an organization, I absolutely look at the org chart. Like I'm going to be honest, like I'll give you, this is the true story. True story. I had somebody pitch me when I was still at Dell. It was a company that was focused on D&I and pitched me and wanted to talk to me about working with Dell for D&I. This organization, so I was like, I'm always curious. Anytime somebody pings me, I always like at least look it up, see what's what. This person did not have a single person of color in their employment base, in their consultancy. And so I'm like, wow. So I think it's brand, I think it's perspective. I think it is aspirational and vision. I don't think it's so much legal. However, with the overturning of affirmative action in the education space, I am curious to see what shakes out. But I think we're still a full election cycle to see kind of what what happens. That's at least my take on it. But great question, Abigail. Okay, Andrea, how do you promote a safe psychological space if you're in a leadership role without a title? That's a good question. Especially if you have to lead up and you're having to lead across. Um, I think one of the best ways that I've learned how to do this is honestly just one on one, right? So I've learned to become a safe space for others, right? There are times when I think about, hey, somebody's pinged me or somebody's texted me or whoever it is, whether I was working in corporate or not. Like, I think part of that is when you're not in a leadership role, when you're in a leadership role without a title, I think it becomes lead by example. I think it becomes being the safe space, right? So it becomes checking in. And I think for me, that actually it had a lot to do with even honestly how I built social capital across organizations, right? So when I'm coming in, I'm not code switching. I am being my authentic best self, right? In the workforce, I'm making sure that when people come, I'm approachable, that I'm a safe person too. And I think when we do that, I think that that helps. Also, when you're in a leadership role without title to promote safe psychological space, here's one of the things I've done. And I think this has a lot to do with, I'll give you all a homework assignment. If you haven't read Crucial Conversations, read Crucial Conversations, because in order to promote a psychological space, if you're in a leadership role without a title, means that you have to speak up when psychological safety has been broken. And how do you do that in a way that kind of leaves everybody whole? That's how I like. That's one of my biggest things is, hey, even if somebody has not done what they were supposed to do, I still am the psychologically safe space in that scenario. Now, I get it because sometimes you'd be like, "Ooh, I'm good. I don't even know if I have the bandwidth." And that's a real thing because that person may have broken psychological safety um, to begin with you. But one of the ways that I do that is I model it. I model courageous conversations. If there's something that needs to get done, I will make sure that I'm doing the things that show psychological safety, right? And it could easily be like, hey, Bob, um, hey, you got a moment? And then you lean into that conversation. And so you figure that out. So that's honestly how I've had to promote it. Because I think it's important to um create safe spaces for everyone. There's nothing worse than like coming to work and being like on edge all the time. Um, and I think that that's kind of how you can go about doing it because it is hard when you are having to influence um, that you're having to influence and lead, but not necessarily having the title to do so. That gets and it's hard because like a lot of people are like, well, I don't get caught up in titles, but like whether you want to agree with it or not, when you're in a role or you're in a leadership capacity and you have the role but you don't have the title, sometimes the title holds power. Like let's keep it 100, right? Like titles matter, um, and they shouldn't matter as much, but they do. And so you've got to figure out. And so now you're having to navigate, okay, where's my social capital? How much social capital am I spending? What are the power dynamics? I do want to create a psychologically safe place. And so one of the things that I've literally done is if I become the psychologically safe person um, for whomever it is that I'm working for, and then if I have to lean into those more crucial conversations, courageous conversations, in order to help foster that. I think that that's there. But here's what I'm going to put an asterisk next to this. Andrea, I'm not saying this is you, so I just want to put that out there. But here's what I'll say. If you do not have what's the word I'm looking for? If you don't have the skill level yet, if you've not acquired the skill to have those conversations, um, don't, right? Like, or if you I'll go back to put your own oxygen mask on. If you're saying, yo, I'm just doing good showing up right now, I am burned out. I also would say, like, don't have the conversation until you know that you can do that. A lot of times, I think we have to feel like you don't want to have to feel like you're always fighting the good fight all the time. That's exhausting. And so it's important that if you need to take the time, if you need to take the breath, it's not your fight to fight right now in the season. That's also okay, and give yourself permission for that. Um, but yeah, that's a great question. But I think it's being the example that you want to see. Um, and then, speaking up as needed. Great questions. I'm glad you're going to revisit. Listen, crucial conversations. I keep it. You guys can't see it, but like over here, I have a floating bookshelf. It's one that is not. I look. True story. I'm a bibliophile. Behind this curtain are took two bookshelves, full of books, and then I have a book wall that's over here. Crucial Conversations is actually one that I keep out on the book wall because I do visit it, and I think it's important. And I can't stress enough, when you talk about D&I, when you talk about psychological safety, even as D&I practitioners, it requires a level of emotional intelligence. And so I would encourage anybody, as we're even talking through this, or one of the things that we don't develop enough is emotional intelligence. How do you go about figuring out how to develop it? Because it's all nuanced, right? If I go into a room and I know I'm about to have a conversation around culture, around D&I, and I go into that room and that room does not look like me, I have to have a level of I have to create a level or space of psychological safety and have emotional intelligence to have the conversation that moves things forward. Right? Because that's actually how you get change in D&I. In order to, like, it's not necessarily I'm going to give in to everything. I'm not going to give in all the time to the culture, to the bureaucracy, to all of those things. But there's a middle ground, and then there's also creating a safe space. Hey, let me, you know, hey Mary, tell me about what's your struggle about, managing a multi-generational workforce. Well, I don't get this part. I don't get, okay, well, like, how is that impacting you? What does that look like? Where are you struggling? Right? What are you struggling to understand? How can I help you? Right? And so, because I'm empathizing with the leader in that moment, doesn't necessarily mean I even agree with everything they've done up until that point, or how they've led, or what that looks like. But by creating a psychologically safe space, they become more open to the ideas and the feedback that I give them. And that's really where D&I is going, and where I think the future of D&I should be, right? Is really focusing on emotional intelligence. Like, what is your EQ? If you have leaders from top to bottom with amazing EQ, back to Oscar's question, I don't know if we need a D&I office, because you have emotionally intelligent leaders who know and understand how all of it goes together. But I think sometimes what happens in organizations is the best person who did the job then becomes the manager of the job, and they're not good managers or leaders, right? Um, and so how do you build emotional intelligence in your leaders? And that, I think, is going to be a big key piece of it, right? Like, um, building emotional intelligence and empathy and empathetic leadership, and um, a leadership accountability, I think would further the cause of DEI faster than any program ever created. That's at least my thoughts on it. Which kind of leads me to my last question, and then I'm gonna skedaddle out of here. I appreciate it. If you still have questions, let me know. I can definitely still hang on for just a few more minutes if you have any other questions, for those of you all who are still watching. So the last question I want to make sure I get to, which is, how can leaders build a culture of accountability and ownership within their teams? Great question. How can leaders build a culture of accountability and ownership within their teams? Here's my thing. What gets measured gets done. So building a culture of accountability and ownership within that, I think that it looks like If you do not have a component of how you're leading or how you're getting the work done in your team member feedback, that's an issue. That's an issue. Right. So how do you build that culture of accountability and ownership is if you don't have it yet and you're still trying to figure it out, step 1 is put it in the system. And then you teach the system, it becomes evolutionary. You'll evolve it over time. You may not say, "Hey, you're responsible for all these things, doing these all the time. I'm going to start holding you accountable." But it may be like, "Hey, I'm going to start holding you accountable for how behaviors first." And in this how behaviors, we may start with um you know, hey, how are you doing at managing talent? Your team is going to measure you on how well you are at managing and talking with them about their careers and frequency. And we're going to evaluate you in that. And in the process of evaluating that, that's going to be part of your end of year review. Now there's accountability. Now the ownership piece of it is, hey, how can I equip you to make sure that you know how to do the thing? Um, and so the last thing I'll say is this before I head out, which is when we think about ownership, um, you know who I think does this really well? If you're not from Texas, there's an organization called HEB. And it is a grocery store that has an occult following. For sure. For those of us who shop at HEB, we do not shop anywhere else. Probably, I'd say the equivalent, maybe up north, is like a Wegmans, which is probably something along those lines of how people feel about HEB here in Texas. Um, but they call their team members partners. And so I think ownership comes with culture. Do you build it like, hey, this is ours? But like for real. Like this is ours. And it goes back to psychological safety because some people can say, we're building the thing, we're doing this is ours. But everything that is done, whether that's feedback or feedback taken and not listened to, or feedback not acknowledged, says otherwise, that's where it is. So how do you create ownership is you figure out, hey, what areas can they own? What areas can they influence? Hey, you said this is actually how we're responding and here's why. Right? And so I think more accountability, more ownership comes when we communicate better. Which also goes back to emotional intelligence and empathy. So thank you all for joining me today. I'll be back tomorrow. Not tomorrow. I will not be back tomorrow. Let me be fair. I will not be back tomorrow. I'll be back next week. So we'll be doing these every week. AMA with LCJ. It's going to be Tuesdays at 2:00 CST time. I've enjoyed it. Dan, Oscar, Andrea, I should sorry. Abigail, thank you so much for chiming in. It was a blast. And I will see you all next week. Bye.